Something is not right, and I can't be the only one who is recognizing that there has been a large number of food recalls.
So back in the early 1900s, it was actually really common to get food poisoning. It was so common, it was like just a random another fucking Tuesday for them. But the reason that changed is because a man named Upton Sinclair decided that he was going to investigate what happens in food factories and in meat packing factories. He decided to write a book. It was a novel based on the facts and information that he found, and it's called The Jungle. Now, The Jungle is a really, really good book. Like, I definitely recommend all bookworms read this. However, it's also a really disgusting book. After I read it, I had a problem with food for quite a while. So I won't go into the details of the book that will probably get this taken down, but I will say that way back in the early 1900s, how people got other people to work in those factories is that they advertised in other poor countries, hey, you can come to America and work for us and get really rich, we promise. So people would go to the United States and they don't know English and they would work for these factories and they thought that they would be making a ton of money because comparatively they were. But what happened was they actually got into a lot of debt because America generally was more expensive than where they lived. The 1920s was filled with a ton of corruption. And I think that you might know where I'm going with this, is that everything seems to be cyclical and that it's happening again. Back then, there was no unions to protect people, and right now there's not really any unions to protect people. But the difference is what happened back then. After that book was published, there was a huge outcry. The public just was disgusted, rightly so. And eventually the President of the United States read that book. That book is the reason that the FDA exists in the first place. It's the reason that companies are required to list ingredients on their packaging on every single food that you see in supermarkets. For a while, working in food factories and working in the meat factories was actually a really good job after all of that happened. They became unionized. They gave pensions and retirement plans. You got really good pay for that type of work. But there was a lot of lobbying to change the public's mind to say that unions were actually bad for America. And that's why they just kind of slowly disappeared. And then working in those factories became something slowly back to where it was back in the 1920s. Except now, instead of targeting poor European countries, they're targeting a country that's right next to the United States. There are food industries that actually advertise in Mexico, hey, you can come to America, you have a guaranteed job, and we'll pay you well. And then they just take advantage of people who don't know English. On top of that, the FDA, they've lost a lot of their funding. So you're right, there has been an increase of foodborne illnesses. There has been an increase of recalls. And that's because large companies, they don't give a shit. They really don't give a shit. As long as there's not a huge public outcry for what's going on, that's fine, because then they're just going to get their money from us. It's stuff like this that makes me actually believe in the 80-year turning theory, that every 80 to 100 years, the cycle just repeats. Maybe it's a little bit better than the last 80 to 100 years. And this time it is, but it's still happening. Because way back then, the rich and the poor were very, very heavily divided, just like they are now. The difference is that we have phones. And just like back then, there is a rise in people who think that unions are good, because they actually fucking are. Now, the real answer to and fix to all of this, to the food recalls and the poor working conditions in these food factories, is basically that we need to get politicians involved. And right now, politics is kind of a shit show, if you don't know. What brings me hope is when I see people succeed in creating a union within that company that they work for, and it actually gives them a livable wage. And I hope that that happens, and I hope that the FDA actually gets more funding, because eating disgusting food is just fucking gross.